Hello, it's Dawn Michelle and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing another round of Decan inspired decks, and I'm going to be referring to my stars within you again because again we are in another sign that I am unfamiliar with. So we are looking at decks that feel like Cancer. Cancer, according to this book, is the feeler. The ruling planet is the moon, its symbol is the crab. The main descriptors are sensitive, moody. We have feminine, water, cardinal, I feel, and then the attributes are nurturing, moody, maternal, empathetic, family-oriented, and clinging. So those were kind of the criteria that I worked off of when selecting my decks. I felt like the last astrological association was hard. This one was even harder because I have very few decks that actually feel like Cancer. I've been trying to do 9 decks in each of these videos, and I really struggled to come up with 9 for this one. And in fact, some of these are maybe not. But we're gonna go ahead and jump in. Most of them are actually indie because I really don't have a lot of, like I said, decks that I would associate with Cancer, and certainly decks that are mass market that I feel would associate with Cancer. Funny enough, if I were including Oracle in these videos, I would have a lot more to choose from, but I decided at the get-go not to do Oracle because that would be too many decks and I would get overwhelmed. So that's kind of biting me in the butt today, but we're gonna roll with it just with tarot decks that feel like Cancer. Let's start with the 3 mass market decks that I have because I feel like each of these 3 hit those kind of main notes for Cancer. So we have something that feels connected to the moon, water, femininity, and also I threw in that moodiness. So the 3 mass market decks that I picked kind of all hit those particular notes. The first one here that we're going to look at is the Linestrider Tarot. Maybe of all the decks that I've chosen, I feel like maybe this one is the one that resonates most strongly with Cancer energy for me. It is a beautiful watercolor deck. There's a lot of white space in this deck, so I feel like that creates that sort of illuminated moon kind of energy. Again, with it being watercolor, it's very fluid. It does also feel a little bit in that maternal kind of energy where it feels supportive and loving and nurturing. It's definitely a deck that I think I could go to for those types of readings. Even the more challenging cards that we see often depicted in the tarot don't feel particularly challenging in a bad way in this deck, right? It's not nice washing it, but it's also not like shoving it in your face. And so I feel like you get a little bit of that, like that mom energy there, right? That maternal energy where it's like, yeah, things are hard, but like if I can soften the blow a little bit, I will. I say that, and then that 10 of Swords comes up and it is actually quite brutal. So like, go ahead and prove me wrong, little deck. That's cool. But I feel like this is one of those decks that really sits well in that Cancer energy for me. It's also very much like a feeling deck, which is weird because there's so much white space. And generally when I have white space in a deck, particularly this much white space, it creates a lot of mental, almost air type of energy. But I think because this deck is made, I think primarily with watercolors, and of course ink, we get all these sort of like splashes in the background of these cards. And that's really, I think, what draws me into that water energy. And so it feels very much in the intuitive feeling state. There's also not a lot going on these cards. So you do kind of have to rely a little bit more heavily, I think, on your intuition to really dive deep into the meanings of these cards because we don't have like a full scene being depicted. There's just kind of a central focus on the card, and then you have like the water and those pops of color that you see throughout, that I think that's where your intuitive sort of feeling state needs to come in order to really work with this deck in a really meaningful way. I think that that's one of the things that also makes me definitely think of this deck in terms of Cancer energy. Again, I know very few Cancers in my life, and I feel like none of the decks that I actually have would I really attribute to them or say that it like resonates with energy that's similar to the energy that I see coming from them. I just don't think I have a lot of that in my collection. So it's really interesting to see where sort of astrologically my collection is very, very light. And this is definitely one of them. So kind of focusing in on that ruling astral body of the moon, I ended up picking Tarot of the Abyss. Again, I think there's a little bit about the artwork that makes me feel kind of in this space. It's line work, it's pen work as far as I'm aware, but there's a lot of like lines and motion and flowy things going on in this particular deck. You can see it here really well in the Chariot. Like even though this is like doesn't look like ocean, it looks like maybe rocks or mountain ranges, it still has a very flowy kind of feeling to it. There's just a ton of movement in this deck, a lot of flow of energy across the cards. And I think also too, because it's black and white, it also really sits in that sort of intuitive moon kind of space for me. There's not a lot of color to tie into. So in kind of sitting in an opposition to the deck we just looked at, where the color is really what's going to draw, I think, your intuitive hits out. For this deck, I feel like it's the use of light and shadow, kind of like when we see the light of the moon, you know, waning and waxing over the course of a month, of a time. And that's really where your intuitive hits are going to come from. Sometimes I think they're going to be stronger than others based on what's going on in the card. But again, I feel like it's a deck that kind of in that flowy feel state kind of things. It's really interesting because when I first got this deck, I was thinking this was going to be more of like an air deck, like a sitting in that mental landscape, maybe along the same lines as like the Fountain Tarot, even though that's totally different art style. But that's kind of where I had pictured it, and that's not really where it's ended up falling so far. It's definitely more in that like the feeling state. Sometimes the line works in this actually like they give me feels that I'm like almost, I don't want to say uncomfortable with, but there's a lot of like cross-hatching and, you know, swirly things that sometimes I think for me personally can create a little bit of anxiety around that. And that's very much a feeling state. So, I mean, not necessarily feeling state you always want to be in, but like there is all this flow and motion and cross-hatching, and there's these layers that some are more apparent than others. So again, kind of harkening back to that moonlight kind of an idea. But it's very much a feeling deck. Like this, each of these cards really resonates, I think, with a very strong feeling associated, more so than I would say a thinking state, right? So just because I had originally thought this was going to be like an air deck, and it turns out to be actually more of a watery deck, and I think that's just because of the way it kind of flows and the ink kind of comes and goes in its depth and its broadness, right? Like it's really closer here in the center, and then it kind of fans out to fade away into the distance. And it's really interesting. I don't know if anybody else would say that this is a Cancer deck, and some of these, again, like I said at the start of the video, are a little bit of a stretch, just me trying to find anything that might fit into this category, because I don't have many. And so I chose this one, but it may or may not sit in that space for someone else. But I do feel like it's kind of like very intuitive, very into the I feel state, which was the kind of key descriptor for Cancer in the particular book that I was referencing. So then moving into that kind of feeling state, but more in the moodiness of feeling state, I have the beautiful creatures. Here's the backs. I think I forget to show the backs. I've edged mine, just to let you know. This deck is very much like an inner teenager deck, but for me, it's also very moody. It's very kind of flowy in that sense too. I do feel like you have to kind of tap in a little bit to intuition, even though there is like titles and keywords and stuff on this deck. Sometimes they don't always like 100% align for me, and so I have to more tap into what my intuition is telling me within the artwork. I feel like it also really relates to the moon energy, right? That kind of shadowy, things aren't always crystal clear in the moonlight, right? We can't really see, like we can't see clearly like it's daylight, right? So things are cast in shadows, things are obscured, things aren't quite what they would be in the daylight. And I feel like this deck really represents that energy well. It's also, like I said, a very moody deck for me. So like I kind of call it my inner teenager deck because that's kind of what it feels like. It's like this, I don't want to kind of an energy with this deck. Like I don't want to, you can't make me, and don't try to put me in your little box, right? There's a lot of feels in all of that. A little bit of like rebelliousness, a little bit of like don't tell me what to do kind of energy, but again also kind of dipping into that intuitive shadowy energy a little bit. Maybe this is like more of the shadow side of that sort of Cancer energy. Again, I'm just going off of the very little bits that I have read about that Cancer energy in the books and through my Decan studies. So I am by no means an expert, but when it came to moody, feely decks, this was the one that definitely came to mind for me. So moving along into the indie decks, which the majority of these are, I chose the Guided Hand Tarot as one of the decks for this particular astrological association. Here's the backs. It does have, I think, a little bit of a sort of watery feminine feel to it. But for me, what this deck really taps into is that sort of mothering, nurturing, maternal kind of energy that we read about in Cancer. And I just feel like this deck does this so well. It's like my most nurturing collage deck. It's like the most maternal out of all of them that I have. And I think it's because it's kind of, for a collage deck, it's quiet. It's like understated for a collage deck. It's also very supportive and very nurturing. I know I just showed this one not too long ago because I worked with it recently. It's definitely one of my favorite like collage decks in my collection, as I mentioned in that past video. Like this is my jam when it comes to collage. This is my preference. There is a bit of earthy energy to this deck as well, but I think when we're looking at like sort of that maternal, loving, feeling kind of energy, that intuitive kind of energy, this deck I think taps into that really well, because a lot of these are like, because it's collaged, some of them, you know, kind of do sit more in that Rider-Waite-Smith sort of energy, but some of them kind of go their own way a little bit, and you kind of have to rely a little bit more on your intuition to kind of suss out what the sort of underlying message or feeling is within the card itself. I feel like this one sits really well in that space of terms of being like really nurturing and loving, very feminine, maybe a little bit of that sort of watery energy. I really had to kind of figure out the difference between Cancer and Pisces, to be perfectly honest, but I think I've got it, and I have way more Pisces decks if my assessment of Pisces is correct, which I think will be way later, because I think that's the last sign. So that will be interesting. So another deck that I felt like really aligned with that very maternal, very supportive, and yet watery energy is the Mother Tarot. Here's the backs. I know I recently showed this one as well because that's, again, another deck that I'm working with, particularly for the full moons. So for me, that moon association is definitely there with this deck, which could mostly be because of the way that I'm working with it, but it does feel very watery. There's like a lot of water in the deck itself, in the cards, which of course, none of which are coming up, right? But it also feels very nurturing, very supportive, very maternal. Also, there was a little bit about like, if your home is good with Cancer energy, then like you're good. And I feel like this kind of represents like that internal idea of home. Like if you're good with who you are on the inside, then like everything else around you is like all the better. And this deck for me does really encourage kind of that self-love sort of energy, but in a very kind of like maternal sort of way. I mean, it is the Mother Tarot, so it's like, I guess, written in the name. Maybe this is a little on the nose. But yeah, it's a really great one. I think that it's just the very feminine, very fluid, but also because I use it in alignment with the full moon, that could be why that moon association is there for me as well. I'd be really curious to know if anybody else like feels the Cancer energy in this deck, or if it's just kind of a me thing because of how I've worked with it. So definitely let me know in the comments, because like I'm really curious about, you know, what you all think about the decks, and which ones would you associate it with the astrological signs that I have. I'm really curious to know, because I am still learning and getting to know all of these. So moving along, this is probably going to be a fairly short little video, because like I feel like I don't have a ton to say about Cancer decks. I chose the Moonchild for the Cancer deck, and part of the reason for that is because, like I was saying, with the Cancer Pisces thing, when I was looking at my decks and I was like, oh, the Star Child is like, spoiler, that's Pisces for me. And I was looking at this one, the Moonchild, and I was thinking that this one maybe sat more in that Cancer energy. There's something about Danielle Noel's artwork that does feel a little bit watery to me, like just on the whole. And I think it's because of her use of layering that it kind of makes things obscured a little bit. It's like you can't always quite see what's going on, because there's so many layers of things, and some of them are like opaque, and there's this, like, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's really beautiful. I love her decks, her art. Like I've said many times, like I'm a fan, I have them all. But sometimes there's a little bit of this obscurity that you see in her artwork. Like here's a good example. It's just like lots of layering, and you can see things coming through, and some opaqueness here and there that kind of reminds me of like trying to look through water, right? It's not crystal clear most of the time. And also with it being the Moonchild, right? It has a very strong connection to the moon energy. It also has a very strong feminine feel. And I just felt like if I was going to put it in any astrological association, it would probably be this one. This might be the closest one. It does feel a little bit Taurus-y. I hope I didn't put it in that one. Maybe I did. I probably should have checked first. But like it's so watery, it's so fluid in the way that she does her digital art, that I feel like it's more in this Cancer energy, even though I think there is a little bit of that Taurus Venus in there as well. But yeah, I feel like this one of like her decks, you know, this one felt more like the Cancer, and then again, spoiler, but the Star Child feels more like the Pisces deck. So I thought this would be an interesting one to put in here. This one I do think feels pretty Cancer. Like now that I'm like looking through it, you know, using that lens, it does feel very flowy, very feminine, very intuitive, very in touch with the feeling state. So I think it's a good pick for that. So the next one, I'm like not 100% sold on, but I have reasons. So this is the Distant Past Tarot. And I think there was something about the turquoises, like check that out. I know I showed this deck in my summer basket, and a lot of these actually were probably in various related seasonal videos, because like they do kind of relate to the seasonal energy for me. But like those turquoises remind me of the ocean. Like I know it's a lot of sky, but it reminds me of the ocean. And so I feel like I get a little bit of a watery vibe with this, but there's also like this moodiness to this deck that I feel like it's in that sort of feeling state. And sometimes that feeling state is like maternal, and I'm gonna, you know, take care of you and teach you something. And sometimes it's a little bit moody, and it's like, again, that sort of inner teenager kind of like, I don't want to kind of an energy. And you can't make me. I don't know. I think it's the use of like the drop shadows and stuff in this deck that really give me that sense of moodiness. Because there's drop shadows. I don't know if you can all see it. Drop shadow, just for anybody who doesn't know, is like when you can see the little shadow behind the item. So it's like everything's on this flat background, and then everything's layered on top of it, and there's drop shadows on almost everything. So it gives this sense of like, a little bit, like you can see it really well here. So there's a big shadow behind these people. It gives a bit of a sense of moodiness to it, because like everything is like haloed in shadow. So it feels a little bit like moon energy too in that sense, because everything's a little bit kind of cast in darkness, but it's like behind it. So it kind of just reminds me of like, you know, like clouds passing across the moon or something like that. And then again, it's the colors of it feel very watery, but it is a nurturing deck overall. Like I would say it's a bit in the maternal. It's definitely a feminine deck for me. But I feel like it does also kind of dip into that, the emotional waters, right? Where it's a very much a feeling deck for me. And there's a lot of kind of that sense of, yeah, moodiness within it. And again, this is always really interesting to me when I do these videos because I'm looking at decks that I've used a ton. Like most of these decks, with the exception of the Mother Tarot because it's new, and the Tarot of the Abyss, are really decks that I haven't used like a ton. So the rest of them though are decks, some of them I've had for years and years and I've used a ton, and it's so interesting to be looking at them through this lens because I'm seeing associations and things within the deck that I wouldn't normally have seen before. So that's kind of cool. So another indie deck that I chose for Cancer is the Dame Darcy Mermaid Tarot. I feel like mermaids are like super Cancer. Like just crab makes me think of beach, makes me think of mermaids, right? Like that's my connection. But it's also, for me, this deck is also very much a fun deck, but it's got a very supportive energy overall, but it actually kind of sits a little bit more in that Two of Cups energy for me. But it has like a lot of water and ocean, and it's a very intuitive, it's a very feely deck for me, right? Like I get, like personally when I work with it, I get lots of feels when I work with this deck. There's lots of intuitive hits that come. It's very much in a sort of felt experience, as like I'm so fond of saying on my channel and everywhere else in life. But yeah, it feels like it sits really well in that Cancer energy because it is like maternal and kind of a little bit like grounded into the feminine and the water. It's not like, from my understanding the little bit when I was trying to again suss the difference between Cancer and Pisces, like Pisces it said was the dreamer, and this doesn't feel more like the dreamer. Cancer was the feeler, and I definitely get that from this deck. This is a deck of felt experience, of feelings, and it's probably, you know, somewhat because like mermaids, crabs, again, you know, follow my thought process there. But I think it's really more just in my experience of working with it. It definitely is a feeling state deck for me, and like I'm super bonded to it, and I've had a lot of work done with this deck, and so there definitely is that connection. But I think even if you sort of take that personal connection out of it, like it's mermaids, it's water, it's beachy, that feels very Cancer to me. The last deck that I'm gonna throw in here, like to be perfectly honest, I kind of hate to show this deck on my channel because it creates such FOMO. It's like an out of print deck. It's the creators have said it's never going to come back into print again. If you are just absolutely jonesing for work from this creator, they do have another deck called the Wild Child, I think. And I think there's an Oracle as well. Like even the backs though, I feel like to not include it as like being like a really solid Cancer deck in my collection almost felt like, you know, a disservice to the video. So I'm gonna include it because it like this is a Cancer deck for me. Like it's super maternal, it's super loving and supportive, and it's incredibly watery because of course it's the Healing Waves Tarot, right? I mean, it's in the name. And it's just one of those decks that I feel like sits really firmly in that Cancer energy. Look at that High Priestess, beautiful. So yeah, I feel like this one is maybe like, I don't know, the ultimate Cancer deck because it is very nurturing, it's very watery, it's like all full of that I feels kind of energy. It's not super intuitive though for me. Like it is, but it isn't. Like it's kind of on the nose. I don't mean that in like a bad way, but like I don't really need a ton of intuition to work with these cards. Like they're pretty self-explanatory. So I don't know that it necessarily dips too much into the intuition for me, but it definitely sits in that feminine, watery, healing, supportive kind of space, which is fantastic. So there you have it. That's a look at some of the decks that I have in my collection that feel like Cancer. I would love to know what decks you have in your collection that feel like Cancer, because clearly like my collection of this style or this association of decks is not very complete because I really did struggle to try and find one. And some of them are like, I mean, some of them I feel like sat pretty well in that energy, and some of them, maybe like the Tarot of the Abyss, maybe not so much. That one might have been a stretch. But anyway, it was really interesting to look through my decks through this lens. So yeah, definitely let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, you'll find links for everything I've shown here in the description box of this video. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I look forward to sharing with you again soon.